Okay, so last night's video ended with the death of Muhammad Ali. Tonight's video is the story of three things in particular: a canal, debt, and wounded nationalist pride. Let's begin the narrative of tonight's video with a man named Ismail, who ruled Egypt from 1863 to 1879. That's his dates of rule, not his life. Ismail was the grandson of Muhammad Ali, and his title was Khedive, which basically translates to viceroy or governor. Ismail, thanks to his grandfather's reforms, was effectively an absolute monarch. He had direct control of the military, there were very few legal checks to his authority, and he more or less controlled all of Egypt's agricultural lands. Ismail also shared his grandfather's ambitions to break with the Ottoman Empire, expand Egypt's borders, and also to compete with European powers economically. These ambitions, however, would lead to financial ruin, not only for Ismail, but also for all of Egypt. To say that Ismail spent lots of money is an understatement. He built palaces in Cairo and Alexandria. He bribed Ottoman officials and increased payments of tribute to the Sultan, all in an effort to gain more autonomy within Egypt. He expanded the military, hiring British and even ex-Confederates from the United States to command his armies. You might recognize this man. This is the same General Gordon, a British citizen who helped defeat the Taiping in China. After he defeated the Taiping, he was hired by Ismail and moved to Egypt. Ismail also conquered the Sudan and the Somali coast. If you recall from last night, this territory up here is where Muhammad Ali conquered. Ismail pushed south into the Sudan and eventually conquered this area, which is in modern-day Somalia. And he did all of this in a time of economic depression in Egypt due to a drop in the prices of cotton. By 1865, the Civil War in the United States had ended, and with it came an increasing supply of cotton in the global market. With the increasing supply of cotton, you have a reduction in the price of cotton. Therefore, Egypt was bringing in less revenue. Despite less revenue, Ismail's spending continued, and the British and French banks were happy to bankroll his massive projects. For instance, British bankers loaned Ismail the money, and British engineers provided the human capital to build a railroad from Alexandria to Cairo. But by far the most expensive project under Ismail was the building of a canal from the Mediterranean Sea, here, to the Red Sea, here. Literally, for millennia, Egyptians had toyed with the idea of cutting a canal right through this area. There are records of ancient pharaohs starting and then abandoning this project. In the 19th century, the idea seemed all the more profitable. If Ismail could build the canal, he could control a direct sea route from Europe to India and China. That direct sea route would go straight through the Suez Canal. European traders would no longer have to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa, which would cut out weeks from their voyages, and Ismail and the Egyptian government could charge exorbitant fees to cut through the Suez Canal. The final deal to build the canal was agreed to between a French businessman and Ismail in 1866. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened to sea vessels. However, by the 1870s, Ismail had spent himself into bankruptcy. French and British creditors, or banks, began seizing his assets. In 1875, just 6 years after the completion of the canal, Ismail had to give up his control of the Suez Canal to British banks. Therefore, and this may be confusing, British banks seized control over a canal built by French engineers with Egyptian labor. The bottom line is that by the 1870s, Britain controlled the canal and not Egypt. But the problem of debt did not go away in 1875. In 1876, Ismail agreed to the, quote, Commission of Public Debt, which was actually a committee of European bankers and government administrators tasked with seizing the rest of Ismail's assets to pay off the spending of the previous decade. This commission seized control of mosques, palaces, railroads, agricultural land, and it demanded that Ismail accept 2 officials, one British and one French, to effectively govern Egypt for him. This system became known as dual control. Half of Egypt's tax revenue would go to Egypt, and the other half would go to European bankers. It might be helpful here to pause and refocus on the broader perspective of ordinary Egyptians. The lives of peasants had not improved under the rule of Muhammad Ali and his grandson. Their land was confiscated, and since there was increased production of cotton and less of grain, there was greater risk of famine. Peasants were now conscripted into the army, meaning that each adult male had to serve, uprooting their lives further. To make matters worse, tens of thousands of peasants were forced to work for little or no pay on the Khedive's massive projects, the canal being just one of several. The icing on the cake were the extraterritorial rights that Europeans claimed in Egypt, just as they were claiming in China. European merchants, engineers, military or government advisors, they could only be tried in Egyptian courts. They could not be tried in Egyptian courts and only in European courts, no matter the crime that they committed. All of this spilt over into a growing resistance movement in Egypt. In 1881, 2 men established the Egyptian Nationalist Party with the goals of overthrowing absolutism and redistributing land to peasants, and finally reasserting Egyptian pride by ousting the foreigners. The intellectual side of the movement was led by a man named Muhammad Sharif. He studied Western concepts of liberty, checks and balances, and a republican system of government. The leader of the military wing was a man named Ahmed Urabi. As protests in Egypt grew in 1881 and 1882, the British and French governments panicked. In an effort to intimidate the protesters and secure the position of the Khedive, the Europeans sent their navies to Alexandria. The move backfired. Urabi, recognizing that the Khedive was now working for the Europeans, called for a revolution. He declared the Khedive a traitor. The French, meanwhile, got cold feet and withdrew their navy, while the British doubled down and started to shell Alexandria from their ships. Urabi, meanwhile, refused to back down, and he seized control of major Egyptian cities and assets, including the newly built canal and railroad. People rallied around Urabi's slogan, which was, quote, Egypt for the Egyptians, and the Khedive's army defected to Urabi's control. By 1882, the British feared most that Urabi would seize control of the Egyptian government and refuse to pay back the loans. The British, therefore, marched an army from Alexandria south towards Cairo. Urabi's forces met the British at the Battle of Kafr el-Dawar, which is not really important that you know that, but here's the remarkable thing: Urabi won this first battle. The British, who were now pushed back onto their ships outside of Alexandria, regrouped, and then they launched an assault directly along the Suez Canal. Here, Urabi was outgunned, and the defeat led to his capture. Urabi was put on public trial and sentenced to death. However, his sentence was commuted, and he was allowed to live in exile. The year 1882 was a decisive one for the British in Egypt. After 1882, the British controlled both the Egyptian government and the economy. The French, because of their hesitation, lost influence in the country. The Khedive would hereafter be confined to ceremonial roles, relying on the British to protect him against his own people. Even the Ottoman Sultan was helpless to watch the British bite off a massive chunk of the Ottoman Empire. The British would remain in control of Egypt until the 1950s and relied on the new strategic trade route with India to increase their wealth and power even further. Meanwhile, Urabi was quietly allowed to return to Egypt in 1901, where he died in obscurity 10 years later. He was a forgotten symbol of a feudal resistance to Western imperialism.